And in the book, I was so blindsided by this turn of events because I loved the two of them. And so then when this happens, I was confused and I was heartbroken and I just like literally could not believe it. Hello, thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about Bones and All by Camilla DeAngelis, published in 2015, and I'm comparing it with the movie directed by the great Luca Guadagnino, which was released in 2022. And this has been requested multiple times, but more recently it has been requested by Pretty Rhea, Lucas Orlando, and Alex King also expressed interest in this. So I hope you all enjoy this video, and be sure and share your thoughts down below in the comments and how you interpret this book and movie. And I know this is a book and movie that a lot of people will avoid due to the subject matter, including myself. When this came out in 2022, I was aware that it was based on a book, but because I knew what it was about, I intentionally avoided it. And so because of that, I want to start out with a spoiler-free review in hopes that maybe I can convince one or two of you to give the book a try. Because yeah, I loved this book. I could not put it down, not because it was suspenseful, but just because I just loved the tone and the atmosphere of this book, and I loved being in this world, which is kind of funny to say. But yeah, we follow our main character, Maren, and I just loved being with her. And she meets up with this character named Lee, and the two of them together are just incredible, and I was so invested in their journey, both their individual journeys, but also the journey they go on together. I just cared so much for the two of them. And this has a YA vibe to it, and it is a coming of age story in a lot of ways, but there's also a romance between Maren and Lee, and again, I just loved their scenes together. And of course, there are things about this that are also dark and disturbing because it is about cannibals, right? That is what Lee and Maren are. Also, I don't know how YouTube feels about me using that word, so I'll probably limit how often I say that particular word. But that aspect of the story is what is going to turn a lot of people off to it. And we get depictions of them eating in the book. However, it didn't gross me out as much as I expected. And I think part of that is in large part because the eating, it symbolizes so much more. And so I was just so intrigued by the metaphor of this and what the author was trying to say. And so I think that aspect of me trying to figure out what it symbolized kind of distracted by how gross I would otherwise think it was. And it's kind of funny too, because there's parts where Maren eats like actual food, and the food is described in such a mouth-watering way, which is ironic considering what this book is about, right? And I feel like that was intentional to have one part of this be so gross what they eat, and then on the other hand, you know, when Sully is cooking up, you know, these different dishes and things, it just sounded so good. So I thought that was kind of ironic, but I'm sure she did that intentionally. But yeah, this is a book I would highly recommend. In case you can't tell, you should definitely check it out. And again, if you're worried about being too grossed out, yeah, I think you should still give it a shot. And then if ultimately you have to DNF it, then you do. But like I said, I think because the eating is symbolic of something else, again, it helped me not be as grossed out. Having said that, when it comes to the movie, the eating is symbolic in the movie as well. However, when you're actually having to see it in the movie, it is pretty graphic and pretty disturbing. And so in the movie, if you're worried you'll be too grossed out seeing it on screen, I would not try to talk you out of that because it was pretty gross. So if you're hesitant about the movie, I'm not going to convince you otherwise because it was hard to watch at times. So I don't blame you if you want to avoid this movie for that reason. But from here on out, I will be getting into the details of the plot, which means there will be spoilers going forward. And so the book and movie, like the basic plot is the same, like they hit a lot of the same plot points, but the details are very different. And so I am initially just going to go over the basic plot, which is the same from book to movie. So we have Maren, who is an eater, and in both book and movie, we start out when she is abandoned by the parent that is raising her. In the book, she is 16, in the movie, she is 18. But yeah, the parent basically tells her, like, it's a lot of work to look after you because they have to live life on the run because of Maren's eating, because her desire to eat, and I'm not talking about food, of course, her desire to eat people, it's like a compulsion that she can't help, and she will go like a length of time resisting, but then inevitably it happens. And so ultimately the parent is like, I can't do this anymore. And so then they just one night disappear and Maren wakes up alone. And so from here, she, you know, rides the bus and hitchhikes just throughout different parts of America. And during her travels, she meets an older guy named Sully. And Sully is also an eater, and she has never met another one. So this is a very unique experience for her because she thought she was the only one. And so she interacts with Sully before then parting ways. And then she meets up with a guy named Lee, who is in his late teens and is also an eater. And the two of them just hit it off. And so they decide to travel together. And we visit Lee's hometown and we meet his sister. And then Maren, her goal is to meet the parent she never met. And so she does end up finding this parent, and they too are an eater. However, they are in a mental institution and on a lot of drugs. And so it ends up, she gets answers to her questions to some extent, but at the same time, it's kind of a downer of a visit. And so from there, she leaves, and she and Lee continue on their way, just living life, traveling America, when eventually Sully returns, and in the end, he tries to kill Maren. However, Lee saves Maren's life. But then by the end of the story, for different reasons between book and movie, which we will get into, the book and movie end with Maren then eating Lee. And in the book, we hear about the first time Maren ate, and she was like a baby or a toddler. She was incredibly young, and so she doesn't remember it. The first one she does remember is a boy she met at a summer camp when she was 8 years old, and she does remember it, and everyone since then she remembers, and she keeps track with this list she has. Whereas in the movie, we hear her dad talk about like a boy at a summer camp where it happened, but it seems that Maren herself has blocked out a lot of those memories because she tells Lee that she is new to remembering. So apparently she doesn't remember any of the times when she was a child, which is not the case with the book. And in the book, when she eats, no one else is ever around, and she always like hides the evidence. Although with the summer camp, she didn't really hide the evidence, but regardless, no one suspected her. And the times after that, she hides the evidence. And so theoretically, someone else points this out, being like, you and your mom didn't always have to be on the run. Like, if you weren't a suspect, like, you could have stayed. You could have just risked it. But the mom, as soon as she knew that Maren ate someone, she's like, we got to go right away. And she doesn't even give time to see if they could get away with it, Whereas this is different in the movie, because in the movie, she and her parent, which by the way, the parent who raises her in the book, it's her mom. In the movie, it's her dad. So that is swapped from book to film. But in the movie, it seems like she and her dad definitely live constantly on the move. However, it's different because the first time we see this happen in the movie, she's at a slumber party and she like bites the finger of another girl when there are other girls watching. And so in the movie, it's like, yeah, clearly they need to go on the run because there were people around who saw. Whereas, yeah, in the book, no one else ever saw. And so theoretically, they didn't necessarily always have to go on the run. And then, yeah, with the dad in the movie, we don't see as much about him as we do about the mom in the book. Like I said, just like how raising Maren made her feel, we see that much more in the book. But one thing I thought was really interesting in the book that is not in the movie is that every instance when Maren eats, it is a male. Well, there's been like a couple females, but most of the times it is a male. And the situation is always the same, where we have this boy/man who is keeping Maren somewhere she doesn't want to be, and they will either like verbally get her to stay with them, or in one case she's with a guy in a car and he locks the doors. And so she's in a situation where she's telling them like, I should go, I shouldn't be here, I need to go, and they like make her stay with them. And so she's in this situation that she doesn't want to be in and she wants out, but the guy won't let her. Or we also have another instance where like she turns a guy down about something, and so then he's like, well, then at least just like sit with me, just stay with me. And so she's like, well, I already hurt his feelings once, I guess I should be nice and just like sit with him for a while, kind of a thing. And so the situation was so interesting because usually this is a situation where the female would be seen as the victim, right? And yet each time, because the male won't let her go for one reason or another, he ends up dying because then the desire to eat comes over her and she kills him. And there is also a reference early on, Maren is reading about insects, where the females kill the male during mating. And so that definitely is a parallel here with her as well, even though the actual act of sex is not involved. And also each of these males with Maren, they're also all very lonely. And that's a huge part too, where they, like Maren, are desiring a human connection. And then we have that with the mom too. She is wanting human connections, and yet she can never maintain relationships or get too close to people because inevitably they have to leave town, right? And so she never has the chance to maintain a long-lasting, meaningful relationship. And of course, again, they could have stayed in a town, especially one where they were more established, but the mom's need to just constantly be on the move and not even risk staying just enforces the shame Maren feels about her condition. And yeah, the movie, like loneliness and the desire for human connection, is a big theme here as well. However, like I said, they don't have the aspect of how whenever she eats, it's because she's in a situation where she is coerced to be with someone, and that person is coercing her to be with them because they are lonely, right? But in both, we just see how being an eater is just such a lonely existence, right? Because they can't team up with normal people, but then they also don't make a habit of traveling together either. So it's a very lonely solo existence. And then Lee also has a lot of shame about him being an eater as well. Each of the eaters, once they reach a certain age, they find their own ways to, their own moral code or something, as Lee says in the movie. But in both book and movie, he makes a point to only eat people that he perceives as being bad people. For example, we have a carnival worker in both book and movie who is mean to a child. And so this bothers Lee. And so he ends up killing them. In the book, it is a girl. In the movie, it is a guy. But he is mean to this kid, and the kid should have won a toy, but the carnival worker doesn't give the kid the toy, which upsets the little kid. And in the book, Lee then plays the game and he wins 2 toys. And he gives one to the boy later, and then he gives one to Maren. Whereas in the movie, he does go up to play the game in order to talk to this person, but he doesn't win the toy and give it to the boy like he did in the book. But yeah, in both, he kills this carnival worker. And in the movie, we find out that the carnival worker had a wife and child. And so when Maren realizes this, because, she got in on this and ate too in the movie. And so when she realizes that he had a family, she feels so horrible about it. And she shames Lee because he is the one who killed him. And she's like, you did that. Like, he had a family. How, we shouldn't have done that. And there's a part when they're in a disagreement and Lee says, like, this is why eaters don't travel together, because when you're with each other, the other person is a reflection of yourself, and they don't like what they see when they're face to face with it, with what they are, because they all have such self-loathing. And in the movie, we learn that Lee does not stay in his hometown, even though he loves his sister. He just will go there briefly and then leave. In the movie, we learn that this is because their dad was getting violent. And so he tells Kayla to go get the cops. And so he is alone with his father. And when Kayla and the cops return, the dad is gone and Lee has blood on him. And so they arrest Lee for killing the father. But then they find out that the blood was Lee's blood. And so then he is released. However, even though there's no evidence that he actually killed his father, the town just starts all of these rumors, right? And so he's just not comfortable staying in town. But he tells Maren the full story is that his dad was an eater who tried to attack him, and then he ends up getting him in a chokehold and knocking him out. And then before the cops showed up, he had time to take the dad's body out of town and then return home. And then he is taken to jail, and then when he is released from jail, he goes back to where he left the dad's body and he eats him. Whereas in the book, this was different, because in the book, we find out the reason he doesn't stay in his hometown is because he had a girlfriend, and he had the girlfriend meet his sister Kayla, so he invited her over. And then his stepfather, so it's not his biological dad, his stepdad is getting, drunk and disorderly. And so Lee, he tells his sister and girlfriend, go in the bedroom, shut the door, and do not come out until I say. And then he proceeds to eat the stepdad. Or it's his mom's boyfriend. I don't know if they were married, but it's implied that he has done this to a number of his mom's boyfriends, because she always picks jerks who are horrible people, and so he always ends up just eating them. But unfortunately, on this occasion, the girlfriend did not listen to Lee, and she chose to come out of the room, and she saw what happened. And so she is just traumatized, and at first she is in shock. But then afterwards, she just goes screaming from the house, and she's trying to tell, she runs to her own home and she's trying to tell her parents what she saw. But of course, they don't think she means it literally. And so they're just kind of confused, being like, wait, what happened? And so they can't figure out what exactly Lee did, but they suspect that Lee did something bad in order to mess her up this way, even if they can't figure out what exactly that was. And ultimately, the girlfriend also becomes institutionalized because, again, she was just so traumatized by witnessing this that she just has to be in an institution. And so this is the reason why Lee doesn't stay in his hometown in the book. But then to talk about Sully. So in the movie, Sully is so creepy right off the bat. He walks up to Maren in the middle of the night and he's smelling her in this weird way. And he says that he can smell that she is an eater. And so he invites her to this house he has been staying in, because in the house, there is this old woman who is on the verge of death. And he says he can smell when someone is about to die. And that's how he picks who he will eat. And so he says that he never eats them when they're still alive. And so she stays with him in this house. And in the morning, the old woman dies and they both eat. And then he shows her this creepy rope he makes out of human hair. And then in the movie, she is creeped out by him, though. And so as soon as he is cleaning up or showering, whatever he's doing, she leaves and she gets on a bus and runs away. But then later on, she runs into him again when she is alone. And he admits that he has been following her and he feels like they have a connection. And she's like, this isn't going both ways. You're creeping me out, essentially. Stop following me. And this really upsets Sully, and he's yelling at her, and then he storms off. And then later, when she and Lee are living together, he shows up where they are and he tries to attack her. Like he has her pinned down, but then Lee comes home right in time and he is able to kill Sully. However, Lee is mortally injured in the process. Whereas in the book, Sully is different because, for one, Maren is in this town she's never been to before, and she's at the grocery store and she meets this old woman who is very nice to her, and she helps this woman with her groceries. And so then the woman takes her home, and the woman, she's like, oh, I'm just gonna rest a minute. Like, why don't you go take a nap in the spare room? And so Maren goes to sleep, and when she wakes up, the old woman has died in her chair. And so Maren is like, well, I don't know what to do now. So then she just goes back to take a nap again. And when she wakes up again, she comes out and she sees Sully eating this woman. And then after he's done, the two of them start talking, and he says that he could smell that this woman was about to die. And again, he says that he never eats them alive, and he waits until they die of natural causes or die of suicide. And that is how he is able to feed in an ethical way. In the book, he does have this creepy hair rope though, which he shows her, and she's just like, oof, like, okay. But despite the rope, she really likes Sully, and she seems to trust him. And again, it's her first time meeting another eater, and he just is very friendly. And honestly, in the book, I liked Sully too at the start. Like, yeah, he's kind of odd, and yet I found him likable. And it isn't until later, because she tells him like, oh, I'm on the search for my father. And so they end up parting ways, but they part amicably. And then she meets up with Lee, and when she is with Lee, Sully comes across them again. And Lee finds this very suspicious. And right off the bat, Lee does not trust Sully. And so that is, I guess, when I started to be kind of wary of Sully as well. And yet at the same time, I still kind of liked him, even though, again, Lee being suspicious kind of made me suspicious too. But even though he's suspicious, the three of them end up hanging out, and they stay at Sully's cabin. And then the next day, Sully has left, but he leaves a note for her. And then later in the book, Maren ends up being alone with Sully at a later point, and she finds out that Sully is her grandfather. So he is the father to her dad, the eater, who's in the mental institution. And Sully has this weird thing about eating family members, and since he can't get to his own son, he wants to eat Maren. However, she is initially able to escape, but then later, when she is living with Lee, like I said with the movie, Sully shows up and he tries to kill Maren. However, Lee is able to save her, and he ends up eating Sully in the book. And in the book, so there is a part earlier when they got a ride with a hitchhiker, but then Lee eats her. And after this, he says, Lee, someone ought to gobble me right up one of these days. It served me right. And this is something that he had said on more than one occasion. And Maren replies, don't say that. Why not? Why shouldn't I say that? I didn't answer. I could never think of a reason. And then the night he eats Sully had a flask of whiskey, so they end up drinking some whiskey. And then we read, your hair, he murmured. He would have used your hair. I'd never really paid any attention to my hair before. It was long and dark and nondescript. But when Lee put his hands on my head, it turned to silk. With gentle fingers, he brushed my hair away from my neck. He leaned in and kissed me there, just beside the place we always went to first. Don't, I said. Because you don't want me to, or because I shouldn't? Don't, because you shouldn't. I know I've been cold. He ran his fingers up and down my arm. I'm sorry, I had to be. And beneath that heavy warmth, the safety I had conjured out of a bottle, I felt my stomach rumble. And then the next morning she tells us that he is gone, and we can tell that she has eaten him, and we then read, I shut my eyes and breathed in the smell of him lingering in the sheets. When he held me, everything had melted away, everything dark and ugly and rotten inside of me. Lee had made me pure. He'd let me do it. But I lay in bed for a long time, wishing with all my heart that he hadn't. Now his name would be written there too. Because again, she keeps a list of everyone she's eaten. And in the book, I was so blindsided by this turn of events because I loved the two of them. And so then when this happens, I was confused and I was heartbroken and I just literally could not believe it. However, I think this is important because the more I thought about it, none of the males before, none of them had willingly sacrificed themselves, right? None of them even knew what was about to happen. But Lee does know, and yet he allows it to happen. And his acceptance of her and sacrificing himself for her right after he had saved her life, it helps her to feel whole. And as we see later, she is no longer ashamed of who she is. And so Lee's sacrifice allows her to love herself and again, to embrace who she is. And in the movie, it's kind of similar, but in the movie, Lee was dying though, because he had this horrible injury, his lung was punctured and he was going to die. And so as he is dying, he asks Maren to eat him. And so we still get kind of the same message where this helps her to accept herself, which we'll be getting into it later in regards to the title of the movie. But still, the fact that he was dying, I think is a huge change, right? Because in the book, he was alive and well, and yet he wanted her to do this anyway, right? But in the book, after this happens, we then see more, and we see that she has just set up shop in this town and she is just living life and things are going good. And there's this college guy that she has been having these flirty interactions with, and she eventually takes him to a back room where she eats him. But before she does, she tells him what she is going to do. But of course, he doesn't take it literal. He's just like, wow, like, I never knew you were so twisted. And he just thinks she's being sexy or something. And so this right here, it's just so different from all of the past times, because for one, she is not feeling trapped, like she wants to get away, and yet this guy isn't letting her leave, right? Instead, she is wanting to be there, and she is the one who lured him to her. And then also the fact that she is not resisting the temptation, because again, in the past, she would be trapped with a boy wanting to leave, but feeling like she couldn't. And then suddenly the desire would come over her and she would want to resist, but then she would just give in. Whereas here, she's just embracing who she is, and she's just giving into her desire, which I interpreted as her accepting herself and not being ashamed or grossed out by who she is, by just being like, yeah, this is what I'm about to do to you, you know? And again, in these situations, women can be seen as like the victims, right? And yet she is turning the tables, right? Because it is actually the man who is the victim. And then this last scene in particular is also very reminiscent to what I talked about earlier about how she reads how female insects, certain female insects and spiders, will lure the males to them and then end up killing them. But then to talk about the movie ending a bit more, as well as the title and how that relates specifically to the movie. So there is a scene when Lee and Maren are together when they come across these two men, and one of them is an eater, and he talks about eating bones and all. And so apparently Maren and Lee, they don't eat every part of the body, and they, you know, the bones, for example, they're not eating that. And so this guy is like, yeah, like once you get to the part where you can eat the bones too, like it's like this turning point in your life when you get to that where you eat everything. And Maren didn't know this was possible, and she's just kind of disgusted at the thought of it. But then in the movie, after she eats Lee, we then cut away, and the next scene, you know, the house had been a mess, right? From like all of this going on with Sully and, you know, Lee bleeding everywhere. And so the house is a mess, but then we cut to the house later and it is perfectly clean. And so it's pretty vague, and I feel like it's open to interpretation, but I kind of interpreted it as her, you know, when she ate Lee, she ate him bones and all, right? And so it's that turning point where maybe it's her fully accepting herself for who she is, the fact that she's willing to eat everything. And also she and Lee, again, they had such self-loathing. They just hated who they were, and they would have given anything to change who they were. And yet they open themselves up to each other, and they tell each other the worst things about themselves, right? But they accept each other. They accept each other, flaws and all. And then in the end, she eats him, bones and all. And I think, again, similar to the book, she has accepted who she is and is at peace with it, I guess is how you could interpret it. But again, I could be wrong. I would love to know what you make of the movie ending. But it's interesting because in the book, talking about eating bones and all is never like this huge thing. And we hear, like, even when they're toddlers, they will eat the bones. So it wasn't, you know, this turning point like the movie makes it out to be. And I actually want to share another interpretation of this ending, because maybe they both die in the end, because the very last shot, you know, we see the apartment or the house or whatever all clean, but it's also empty, like they've moved out. And then we see them in this open outdoor area. And since we know that Lee was for sure going to die, it seems like now getting this shot where he is with Maren, it almost seems to imply that they are both dead and they're just living, you know, a peaceful existence now that they are dead. I don't know. But again, I don't know if they're, like, if you asked the screenwriter or the director, I don't know if they would say there is a concrete interpretation. Again, I would love to know your thoughts. Now I almost think that the fact that they both die might be the more plausible idea with that final shot of the film. But again, share your thoughts down below in the comments. But something else I want to talk about are the people who are not eaters, but who have this weird fascination with eaters, because we get this in book and movie, but it's very different. Because in the movie, that guy they meet who talks about eating bones and all, he is with this other man, but this man is not an eater. Like, he's not a born eater the way, you know, like Sully and Lee and Maren, like they can't help it. It's just this desire they have that they have no control over. Where this man, he has become an eater by choice. And so Maren, again, she is just like, wait, what? Like, you you don't have to be this way. Like, you're choosing to be this way. And she is just disgusted by that. And in the book, we get a scene that was kind of similar where the nurse who is caring for her father, he has been caring for the dad for 14 years in this mental institution. And so they know each other very well. And he knows that the dad is an eater. And at the end of his shift, he has Maren come over to where he lives. And once he realized the truth about her dad, like, he kind of like went down the rabbit hole. And for years now, he has just been researching eaters and everything about them. And then he goes on to tell Maren how lonely he is and how his mom was like the only person in his life, but then she died. And so now he just lives a very lonely existence, which again is a huge theme in the book, but also the movie. But then from here, he asks Maren to eat him. And he doesn't explicitly say it, but it's like heavily implied that that is what he is wanting her to do. But she tells him like, oh, like, it's not like that. I can't just turn it on. Like, it has to be a desire that just comes over me, you know? So like, I'm not in the mood. So no, I'm not going to do that. But then ultimately, Sully, I guess, ends up finding this guy. And so he is eaten by Sully in the end. But some other changes I wanted to talk about. So in both book and movie, we have the parent in the mental institution who is an eater. In the book, it's her father. In the movie, it's her mother. But in both, they had written her a letter just in case she ended up finding them at some point through the years. And in the movie, at the end of this letter, the mom tells her, like, this world of love doesn't want monsters in it. And she considers herself and Maren a monster. And so after we hear this in voiceover, the mom then tries to attack Maren to eat her, but then Maren is saved. And this was not the case in the book. In the book, the father does not try to eat Maren, but he had eaten, in the book, he had eaten one hand. In the movie, she had eaten both of her hands. But also that was different too, because in the book, it seems like the reason he ate his hand was because he had never, the thought of Maren being an eater too had never occurred to him. But then at some point in his years in this institution, the nurse who I talked about earlier, he mentions to the dad, like, what if she's an eater? And the dad is so distraught by the thought of this that then he eats his hand. Whereas in the movie, she did it just because she's an eater and she wanted to eat, and her own hands were the only things available, I guess. And then in the movie, Lee and Maren definitely have like a romantic relationship, I would say. Like, you know, like they're kissing, they're being intimate. So it seems like they are definitely in love and in this relationship. Whereas in the book, they still have just like such a sweet bond, and Maren definitely has romantic feelings towards Lee. However, nothing physical ever happens with them. And so that is a big difference, where in the movie, it was more explicit, like, yes, like they are in love. At least that's how I interpreted it. Whereas in the book, I loved their relationship. As I've said, I just loved their interactions and their bond, and it was so sweet, but it wasn't as much of a romantic relationship as it was in the movie. And then also in the movie, so she meets Lee at a Walmart in both book and movie, and there is this drunk guy causing a disturbance, and in both, Lee like takes the guy outside, and then Maren doesn't see them again. And in the book, then there is a Walmart employee who is nice to Maren, and after this guy's shift, when Walmart is closed, he takes her to his car, and then this is the guy where she's like, I should go, and he locks the car doors, being like, no, like, please stay longer. And then from there, she eats him, and then when she gets out of the car, she sees Lee standing right there, and Lee had seen what happened. And this is how they realize that both of them are eaters. Whereas in the movie, it's different because there is no Walmart employee, and instead, he takes that drunk guy outside, and then later, she sees Lee after he had eaten the drunk guy. So that is how they find out that they are both eaters in the movie. And then also in the movie, Sully kills Kayla, Lee's sister, which was very sad. They find her hair in his gross rope, whereas in the book, Kayla does not die, Sully doesn't kill her. And then also with this book, it did not come across at all to me like a commentary on eating meat. It didn't seem like that was part of the symbolism at all. Whereas in the movie, we do get one scene where they go to a slaughterhouse and they see cows before they've been killed, and they say something like, oh, each of these cows like comes from a family of its own, or something like that. And so it seemed like that was kind of a moment where the movie was making a commentary on eating animal meat. But again, I didn't sense that theme in the book at all. And then even in the movie, I felt like there were so many more themes going on, so much more commentary going on that had nothing to do with eating animal meat. But I did want to acknowledge that even though I didn't think this came across as a commentary on eating meat, in the acknowledgement, the author talks about how she is vegan, and she goes on to say, I believe the world would be a far safer place if we as individuals and as a society took a hard, honest look at our practice of flesh eating along with its environmental and spiritual consequences. To that end, I'd like to thank Will Tuttle, whose book The World Peace Diet helped me clarify my purpose as I was revising Bones and All. So I guess she thinks it is a commentary on eating meat, but I did not. I read the acknowledgement after I read the book. And so, yeah, I was a little confused by that, I guess, in some ways, because I didn't get that vibe from it while I was reading the book. But I would love to hear if you did while you read the book. But when it comes to book versus movie, so I loved the casting of this movie, and I know I'm biased because I went into this book knowing what the movie cast looked like, and yet, yeah, Timothee Chalamet, he was just perfect as Lee. Like, for this adaptation to be made at this time in Hollywood, he is just the perfect choice. Like, while I was reading it, he was just perfect. I could see him so clearly in my mind playing this character. And then also, I think Taylor Russell was fantastic as Maren, and they both, like, they had such great chemistry, and they both just brought these characters to life in such a real way. And again, I was so attached to them in the book, and so to see them brought to life on the screen in such a beautiful way, yeah, I thought it was perfect casting. And then while there are like some really sweet, touching, powerful moments in the movie, there's obviously some gross and disturbing moments. And one disturbing moment is when they meet that guy who is paired up with the man who eats by choice. But the eater in the group, the one who talks about eating bones and all, he is played by Michael Stuhlbarg, the guy who played the dad in Call Me By Your Name. So in Call Me By Your Name, he plays just like such a warm, wonderful, smart, sensitive, intelligent person who is so caring and so loving towards his son, and he gives a fantastic monologue. And then we have him here where he plays this like such a creepy, gross guy who you just can't wait for Lee to get away from them, right? Lee and Maren, you're just like, oh, like get away from this guy. And so what a drastic difference in characters, right? And so that was impressive though. So he's definitely a good actor. And then, of course, Call Me By Your Name was also directed by Luca Guadagnino, the same guy who directed this movie, Bones and All. So it always is cool. I do like seeing directors who return to working with certain actors. But yeah, and then we have Sully, the character of Sully. And he is like one of the bigger character changes from book to film because, like I said, in the book, I started out liking him, whereas in the movie right away, you know that something is off and he is bad news. And I think I preferred his characterization in the book instead. Like, I liked it better how at first we, like Maren, trusted him. And then over time, you start to realize like, ooh, like something's wrong here. And then finding out that he was her grandfather was an unexpected twist. Whereas, yeah, in the movie, he's just this creepy villain that you don't trust right from the start. And so I just preferred him as a character in the book. I found him just a bit more interesting and complex, I guess. Not that he's not complex in the movie. Clearly, he's lived a solitary life as an eater, and it's definitely messed him up, right? But yeah, also this theme, going back to book Sully, how he wants to eat his family members. You know, that's a theme in the book with Sully, but then we see that in the movie too with the mom trying to eat Maren. And so I don't know if that, you know, between the family, if that is representative of some other type of theme, like if it's a metaphor for something else. Obviously, you could see it as like these familial cycles, these negative familial cycles that are passed down generation to generation until someone puts an end to it, right? But I don't know if it's a commentary on that or, yeah, I don't know. Let me know your thoughts on that aspect down in the comments. But yeah, in some ways, I think just in general, I found the book more thought-provoking. And then also, to be honest, as much as I do love certain things about this movie, I don't know if I ever would watch it again because it was gross in those certain times. And granted, I could just fast forward through certain scenes if I do decide to watch it again. Whereas this is very different from the book because as soon as I finished it, I wanted to go back and read it all over again because again, there was just so much depth to it. And so there was so much to think about and process. While at the same time, again, I just loved the atmosphere of it. And then that moment when she eats Lee, again, I was just shocked when I read that in the book. And I think in some ways it feels more significant and more shocking in the book because, again, he wasn't dying. And the movie, him dying just totally changes that scene, in my opinion. And so the fact that he is healthy and living and he puts himself in this situation where he wants her to eat him, yeah, I think it just really is more impactful ultimately. And I think there's just more to that than there was in the movie. And also, like, I was mad at Maren in the book after I read that initially because I'm like, what? Like, he was such an amazing person. He cared about you. You cared about him. Like, how could you do that? And so I was so so angry at her. Whereas in the movie, again, you're not angry at her because he was gonna die anyway. So yeah, that was an interesting change. And I kind of wish they hadn't done it that way. It makes more sense. And I feel like the audience, again, if they kept it like the book, the audience would have just been like, what? Like, how could she do that? And so I guess they didn't want the audience feeling conflicted about her choice to do that. But yeah, anyway, I think I preferred the book as far as that goes too, even though, again, in the moment, I was so confused by it. Yeah, I feel like I'm kind of rambling now. But basically, when it comes to book versus movie, I will say that the book wins for all of the reasons I have gotten into. And again, I would highly recommend this book. I would love to know what you thought about it. I would love to know if you've read the book, if you felt the same, where, because I was hesitant going into it. I didn't know if I would be able to make it through this book. But again, just the metaphors and the depth to the story made me not as grossed out as I otherwise would have been. So let me know if you felt the same. Let me know what you think of this movie. And then I do have a book versus movie for Call Me By Your Name. If you want to check that out, I will link to it. And Luca Guadagnino, he has another movie coming out later this year starring Daniel Craig, which is based on a book by William S. Burroughs. I think that's the author's name. So I do plan to cover that. So more Luca Guadagnino content coming in the future. And then I've covered many Timothee Chalamet projects at this point, Dune, Little Women. I would love to do Beautiful Boy at some point, but I keep putting that one off. But anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.